time in the country's history and culture. And Haiti is known, though Haiti is known for its long history, as you mentioned before, it's not part of the narrative about the country. So, what were some of the things that fascinated you in your research about learning in terms of Haiti's history? And what are some of the top historical sites that you think people should know about and you discovered while you're there?
I think the thing that I found really interesting is that the history seems quite alive and relevant, and people reference it a lot. You know, people will talk about current political situations.
You mean the Haitian?
Yeah, and referencing, you know, figures. They'll talk about Dessalines, or they'll talk about, you know, whoever, you know, and people are a lot aware of that. And I'm sort of quite conscious, you know, I'm British, but we sort of seem to be quite, you know, we've got a very, very long history, but people don't talk about, you know, 1066 or the English Civil War or anything like it's irrelevant, but people still talk about, you know, Charlemagne Perrault or you know, things like that. So that was sort of quite fascinating. I think there's that sort of continuity, and I think that's reflected in sort of the way that sort of a lot of the historical figures have then sort of become sort of absorbed into sort of the voodoo pantheon. And you look at sort of Vodou, Farai, and things like that, and you see things being represented in those ways as Loire. In terms of some of the sites, one of the most interesting places. I mean, of course, the Citadel, obviously, you know, it's incredible, and I'm not saying that in a good way. I mean, I think the Citadel, it's the equal of Machu Picchu. I really believe that. I think it's one of the most amazing sites in the Americas.
Machu Picchu as in
Machu Picchu in Peru. I mean, the Inca Empire. I absolutely say that without doubt. You know, I hike the Inca Trail, and I think Haiti has this incredible site, and I am staggered that whenever I've gone there, it's been me and maybe two other guys and the person who brought the course up. And anywhere else in the world, you know, there would be hundreds of people there, and there would be kiosks, and there would be people selling little dolls of Christophe, and there would be people with concession stands, and everyone in Milo would be making money off it, and the economy would be benefiting. So the Citadel, of course, and I think, you know, if you haven't been to Haiti and you go to Haiti, then you have to take the opportunity to go to the Citadel. So other side things that were new to me, I really enjoyed Marchand Dessalines in the Artibonite. And there's a chain of Marchand Dessalines in Artibonite. And there's a chain of 5 forts. He tried to move the capital after independence. So his wife was from there, and you can actually still her house, the House of Claire Heureuse, is there, and you can still visit that. And there are these 5 forts that sort of guard the approach to the entire entrance to the valley, really. And they go up on this sort of series of hills that rise up. And the one that's right in the centre of town, there's sort of there are pools and sort of water systems, but those are actually now being used by the locals. So you go down there, and there's amazing, you know, forts that were built in about 1802, and now the systems are just full of people doing their laundry, and kids running about, and people hanging their washing out over old cannons that were cast from Napoleon's army, and it's a really sort of an alive place. And then you can sort of hike up to this little network of hills, Fort Décibel and some of the others. And again, you know, it's just you. This is the thing. It's just you, and you don't have anyone sort of coming up and trying to sell you something. And it's incredible. And I didn't see any foreigners there. So people. It was just a real sort of treat to sort of. I felt like, I mean, I didn't discover them. You go there and you feel like you're sort of finding something new. And there are so many places in Haiti like that. You go near Hanche, in the Central Plateau, Gondol Saint Raphael and Saint Michel de la Palais, and there are caves that have got the petroglyphs, the stone carvings from the Taino Indians. And there are some which are not very well known, which actually I was asked not to put in the book because people don't know them and they're being recorded by archaeologists. And there are some which have got quite a lot of graffiti. But what's interesting is a lot of the carvings were, you know, several thousand years old. And then you go to the back of the cave, and these caves are still being used as sacred sites because there are empty bottles of Barbancourt and burnt out candles, and people are using them for voodoo. So there's that sort of, again, that sort of cultural continuity. And so you sort of feel that the history is sort of really alive and is sort of actually still sort of relevant in a way that it's not an aspect, which is something that, I've just found really, really interesting.
Now, I'm glad you brought this up to the culture, because I think this is really important, that Haitian culture lends itself to celebrating its own history in its everyday life. Can you talk a little bit more about discovering or researching Vodou and therein also having to learn some Creole in order to do that, and talk about what would a traveler, what sort of insights, interesting thing that a traveler is visiting Haiti can learn from the guide about Vodou and about Creole?
Well, the first time I went to Haiti, I don't know what my expectation was, that sort of voodoo was going to be everywhere, and I just expected to sort of see it everywhere, and I was really surprised because I didn't see it. And you go out on a Sunday in Port-au-Prince, and everyone's in their Sunday best, and they're all going out to church, and they've all got their Bibles, and the women put their nice dresses, and the guys are in suits, and I was like, oh man, come on. Where's the voodoo? And it's probably a really terribly, horribly cliche, blunt thing to want to come and see that. But then I was chatting with someone who was I met a oungan in Savagier, which is just near Jacmel, and we were talking about it, and he sort of said, no, it's more like it's like a sort of he used the metaphor, it's like an electricity grid. And the whole country is sort of wired, and then it's like these points, that you can sort of plug into. And then once he sort of changed my perspective, you suddenly saw little things everywhere, little paintings of Loire or the sort of Veve symbols and things like that. And I went out to another historical site, Fort Picolet, which is just outside Cap Haitien. So it was on the coast. It was built by the French originally when Cap Français was sort of the most important French colonial city in the world. And there's a peristyle in the middle of the fort, and there are these just guys hanging around there, and they said, interested in that, and I'm sort of practicing my sort of terrible Creole with them. And they said, well, there's other sites, come and have a look. So we sort of walked off into the bush somewhere, and I thought, well, this is the moment where we find out if they're really cool guys or whether I'm going to stick the end. And then there was a cave, and they said, oh, just go into the cave. It was in the ground. And you go into the cave, get a ladder, and go down into the. I'm like, this is really.
You're by yourself.
Yeah, I'm by myself. this is just obviously, my parents came to get my remains. I'm going to get into such trouble. And but I said, no, after you. So someone went first, and then we went down there, and I mean, there couldn't have been anyone in the site more than, I don't know, an hour or something, even if they'd just been in there. But there were candles burning, and there were Veve on the ground, and I can't remember off the top of my head. And he said, oh, this is an area that's particularly associated with this particular Loire. And there were little sort of votive tokens of rags and things tied up in the branches of the trees, and of course, again, empty bottles of rum. And that was sort of quite illustrative to me. That sort of, it's not overt in the same way that you see a church or a cathedral, but sort of once you have your eyes open to it, and particularly in the rural areas. I mean, of course, you don't see it so much if you're in the city, but once you're in the rural areas, particularly, you see those signs of people just getting on, and sort of the voodoo is very much more sort of just fabric. It's sort of woven more into the sort of the fabric of everyday life. But it's not this big overt thing. I mean, larger towns will have a peristyle.
So you're saying you discovered that Vodou is actually part of Haitian culture,
yeah,
not necessarily a separate
and
religion.
It's difficult. I remember when I did the first time I did a bill for Lonely Planet, and they were like, put something in about seeing a voodoo ceremony as if you would go to a church on a Sunday or go to a mosque or something. The Muslim world. So it's sort of hard because you can't really go out and map the peristyles. You have to sort of just be there and talk to people and meet people, and then they'll say there's a thing happening. Unless you go for this Fête Gala, or unless you go to Sodo in July or Souvenance, when there are the particular, festivals. It's something you just have to spend a little bit of time and meet people and talk to people, which I see in a way is sort of a little bit more rewarding. It's a hard thing to write about as a traveller.